Well, let's talk about the challenge that we have today. So this is an intellectual challenge, and as I said, it is not for every atheist. It's not going to apply to atheists that are, well, so the target are lack theists, more accurately. So some atheists will define atheism as something like, well, I just lack belief in God. And so that's what this challenge, those are the types of people who this challenge is targeting. So the first thing I want to talk about is scales of belief, and this is all going to be relevant to the challenge. So when I hear some people talk, or some atheists talk about belief in God, and to me it sounds like they've got a scale in their mind of like 0 to 100. So 0 is you have no belief about P. P is just any proposition you can put in there, so like God exists. So 0 would be no belief about P, and 100 will be you fully believe that P is true. And I think some atheists think that that's all there is to the scale. And you can see this is the top scale. There's 2 scales here. But in reality, there's actually a sort of negative side to it where you believe that P is false. So you can believe that P is true, or you can believe that P is false. And so that's why I think the correct way to think about this is that you can go from 0 to 100, but you can also go from 0 to sort of negative 100.
The object of your faith when you're a Christian isn't historical scholarship. It's not these ways of knowing that have been tried and tested in universities and are fallible and are constantly being revised and constantly being re-explored. The object of a Christian's faith has to be the revelation of God in the person of Jesus Christ, resurrected and present and available in the lives of Christians right now. That revelation is directly accessible to us. We don't have to look at ancient history to go dig this up or try to find evidence that Jesus is alive. For the same reasons, I don't have to find evidence that I don't have to go look at birth records to find out evidence that my husband's alive. I can talk to him and interact with him. And Jesus is the same way, right?
Jesus is the same way as your husband? Of course not. Unless you can actually touch Jesus, like you can touch a coffee cup, because you can touch your husband. Unless you can audibly hear Jesus like you can audibly hear your husband. When your husband farts, you can smell it. Can you smell Jesus's farts? I don't think so.
The burden of proof is often, you could say, misconstrued or misunderstood online. So in here, T just means God exists. And so basically there's 3 different attitudes that you could do, or 3 different things that you could say about T. So you could assert that T is false. That's all the way on the left. And in that case, you do have a burden of proof. We're going to get to an example in a moment of, like a different example apart from God, why that has to be the case. In the middle, you can assert nothing about T. You could say nothing about God's existence. And in that case, you don't have any burden of proof because you're not saying anything about T. You're not saying anything about God's existence. But then on the further side, assert that T is true. This is the context in which most theists are operating. They're asserting that theism is true, giving arguments and evidence. And in that case, everybody agrees you've got a burden of proof. My point is that on the opposite side of the scale, where you assert that T is false, then you still have a burden of proof.
We're asking, do extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? This is a claim that you hear a lot from atheists. They say something like, well, a man coming back from the dead is extraordinary, and so you've got to give me extraordinary evidence, basically, if you want me to believe it.
Is that you basically are very explicit with what these claims are from the Catholic Church about the papacy. The explicitness of these claims and how explicit they are and just how wild they are. Some of these claims are really wild, and you would expect, well, what I'm thinking of is that these claims are so specific and so detailed, some of them, that you would need some really good evidence in order to affirm that, other than just like, tradition or some sort of testimony. I believe, and I would go so far as to assert, that there are no tigers in my office with me. I would make that assertion. But if I'm doing that and I'm asserting that, say in a debate, then I've got to defend that. I've got to have some kind of I have a burden of proof to defend why I believe that. No,
Well, to add to that, the way you might do that is to show that the entity that we refer to as a tiger is an animal that if it were in the room, like the size of the room you're in right now, you would expect to be able to see it.
So the obvious objection is, why doesn't God simply remove our subjective desires and give everyone a basic sense of his existence they cannot deny?
Yes, exactly. Why must salvation be a two-step process? First belief, and then a chosen relationship. Since this first step is a stumbling block, and isn't something anyone can actually choose for themselves anyhow, why not simply remove it?
Each person making a claim has to give some reason why, give reasons why there is or isn't a tiger there. And frankly, there's a lot on the line in that.
You only have to
analogy.
read a few select verses from the Old Testament to realize that God is never particularly happy when people decide to pray to the wrong deity. Okay, the first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Not thou shalt not deny me, not thou shalt believe in me, but thou shalt have no other gods before me. And this implies that which God you decide to pray to is at least as important and possibly more important than choosing to pray to a God at all. And in this respect, atheists might actually be better off than people who are part of the wrong religion. Okay, if you get to the pearly gates and you're stood there as an atheist next to a Muslim, God might look at you and think, well, at least you said, I don't know. You chose not to believe in this God, but that was just based upon lack of evidence, whereas the Muslim was praying to the wrong God. And who do you think he'd look upon more harshly?
in the analogy with the tiger can be applied to the scales of belief too, because I believe that, so let's say that P is, there is a tiger in this room. I believe that that proposition is false. I have that belief. It's not just that I lack a belief about that. I don't just lack belief that there's no tiger in this room right now. I believe by just looking around that there's no tiger in here. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you can have a scale like this. You can have this sort of negative scale, the negative 100. You can believe that something is false. But in that case, on the next slide, if you assert that T is false, then you've got a burden of proof. You've got to defend that.
So I have these active beliefs that determine how I live my life day to day, that go even beyond my death, but your goal should be to reverse the burden of proof. Because I'm tired. I'm speaking for the Christian. I'm tired of always having to defend it. Why don't you stinking atheists defend your worldview for once? This is going to bother Christians listening, but I'm going to speak to atheists right now. Atheists, when you're interacting with Christians, don't make any claims at all. This will bother them. They so badly want you to say something and claim it. And if you do claim something, you say, well, from my perspective, I'm not convinced the Bible, the Gospels are reliable. And if they ask, why? What do you mean by that? Well, in my experience, people who die stay dead.
The challenge has to do with, again, this definition that some atheists give about atheism, this sort of lack of belief in God. On the American Atheist website, you can see here, atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God, nor does it answer any other question about what a person believes. It is simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. Atheism is too often defined incorrectly as a belief system. To be clear, atheism is not a disbelief in gods or a denial of gods. It is a lack of belief in gods. So we have this very clear exposition of what it means to be an atheist, and this is a lack of belief in gods. That's what the American atheists say. Now, what Braxton has noticed is that there's a conflict between that and what some atheists say sometimes. So from the same people, the same organization, the American Atheist, this is a billboard that they produced. Just skip church, it's all fake news. Now, to me, that sounds like that's not just like, oh, okay, we just lack belief in God. You're claiming that it's fake. You're asserting that that thing does not exist. And so there's a tension here.
They really hate atheists saying, I just lack a belief in your God. There's some person somewhere on this planet who believes a certain God exists, and I know nothing about this person or the God they worship. In that case, I truly lack a belief in that God. I know nothing about it. I'm unaware of it. And I would say these three would be the same. But I would say I'm a hard atheist against Christianity.
Here's the dilemma. You can basically pick one. You can either A, claim to merely lack belief in God, or you can compare God to beings that you believe don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's like one of the most common examples that you hear in B is sometimes atheists will compare God's existence to like Santa Claus, where not only are they saying that atheism is this sort of like lack of belief kind of situation, they're also in certain scenarios, even in a debate, will say, look, belief in God is just like belief in Santa. But the challenge again is basically that you can't do both. You can't claim to merely lack belief in God and compare God to beings that you believe don't exist.
I'm here to put an end to your blasphemy. This time we finish it. There can be only one.
If you make a comparison between God and something like Santa, there's a real question about whether or not you believe that Santa doesn't exist. That's a real question. And I think most people have that belief. They believe that Santa Claus does not exist. Now, maybe as a result of seeing this video, watching this video, you may want to take a step back and kind of like say, oh, no, I don't actually have the positive belief that Santa Claus doesn't exist. I just lack belief in Santa. In that case, okay, that's okay. You can make that move. I just don't know that it's a good move to make. I think most people know that Santa Claus doesn't exist, and if you know it, then you also believe it.
And
Right.
and so I've had people say, no, I really do just lack a belief in Santa Claus. But when I hear that from someone, it comes across to me as a little bit disingenuous that you merely lack a belief in Santa Claus. Because like you said, Cameron, I think most adult human beings probably actively disbelieve or believe that Santa does not exist.
The thing about Father Christmas is that when children finally realize there is no Father Christmas, they're quite happy about it. And the odd thing is that they don't do the same thing with God.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So if I was to go up to anybody, any adult, let's say an adult, and ask them, what are your beliefs about Santa Claus? Do you believe that Santa Claus does not exist? I think pretty much everybody would say, yes, I believe that Santa Claus does not exist.
Growth in numbers are terrible indicators of truth. There was a time when everyone believed the world was flat, but the idea was not any more true then than it is now.
You may say, no, the top scale is the correct one because I'm at 0. I don't, as it comes to Santa Claus or with God, I don't think I have any good reason to believe that Santa Claus is real. And I don't think I have any good reason to believe that God exists. Well, that's fine, except for the fact that you actually have reasons to think that Santa Claus does not exist. And that would have to do with an analysis of where the story came from. And
prior to the Moses story, the Israelites believed in a pantheon of gods, and El Shaddai was more or less the top of the pantheon. And then after the Moses story happened, there was a shift. And the shift was to more of a Yahweh type God that was very monotheistic.
And yet, paradoxically, the very assertion of continuity only serves to underscore a fundamental discontinuity. Because even as God asserts that he is the God of the patriarchs, he reveals to Moses a new name, Yahweh, so that Yahwism can be said to begin only with Moses. And to understand that new beginning, we need to look at the differences between patriarchal religion and the new Yahwism. In the patriarchal traditions, all right, so we're talking about Genesis primarily. I've thrown in some other texts also, but focusing for a moment on the patriarchal traditions of Genesis, God is 6 times called El Shaddai. El is the name of the chief god in the Canaanite pantheon.
El is the name of the chief god in the Canaanite pantheon. Now, if I take myself back 10, 20, 30 years, and I hear this, I'm thinking, yeah, but the Canaanites just took stuff from the Israelites. That's what's going on here. The problem is, you can say that, but historians like Christine Hayes here will tell you, no, it's the other way around.
Flip over to the other side of your handout, where I discuss an important set of texts that are written in a language very, very close to Biblical Hebrew. It's clear that Hebrew is simply a Canaanite dialect. In fact, I remember reading one scholar said if you go back far enough, you're really hard-pressed to tell the difference between Canaanite and...
That's an interesting tidbit. Like, Christians, are you aware that the Canaanite language and the Israelite language were basically dialects of each other, very similar?
Hebrew. And in these texts, we read of the exploits of the gods of Canaanite religion. These gods include the sky god El, the father of the various gods and humans. El has a wife, Asherah, she's a mother goddess, and then their son Baal, who is a storm god. There are striking resemblances between the biblical God of the patriarchs and the Canaanite god El. El is the head of the council of gods.
El is the head of a council of gods. So if you are familiar with the Old Testament, where have you heard that before? Let me bring up Psalm 82, verse 1. So the Canaanite god El, was the head god of a pantheon of many gods. This is Psalm 82, verse 1. God presides in the great assembly. He judges among gods. Let me get a better version here. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So for all you Christians who don't think that there exists other gods, you gotta read Psalm 82. There's many gods, just you believe Yahweh is the top god.
His epithets include father of all creatures, bull, king. He's also described as the protector of patriarchs, patriarchal figures, a god of the father of the clan, it says in the text. He guides them, he protects them, he promises them descendants. Many biblical passages depict God exactly this way, as the head of a council of divine beings. He's occasionally described with some of the epithets that are associated with El. He's referred to as the father of all creatures. There are poetic passages in which he is referred to as bull, also certainly as king. And in the patriarchal narratives, God refers to himself as the God of the Father. I am the God of the Father, the same way El is referred to. He guides and protects the patriarchs. He makes promises of progeny to Abraham and his heirs.
Now, if you're a Christian listening, what you have to do at this point in order to keep your sanity, I think, is just, if you don't know this stuff, you're going to have to find someone who does, and focus in on all the differences between the Canaanite god El and El Shaddai of the Old Testament, and after the Moses story, Yahweh. And you just got to focus on the differences and ignore the similarities that Dr. Christine Hayes is talking about here.
In which he will dwell. Many personal and place names in the patriarchal narratives are compounds in which one element is El. Yisrael, Yishmael, Beth El. El is the God of the patriarchs. By contrast, after the time of Moses, Israelite names start to be formed using Yah or Yahu as part of the name Yahweh. Elijah in Hebrew is Eliyahu. So you start to have theophorics, names that use a name of a deity, which are using forms of Yahu instead of El. There are other descriptions in the Bible of God, which are much more reminiscent, however, of the storm god, Baal. According to Canaanite mythology, Baal defeated El and assumed his position at a certain point as the head of the Canaanite pantheon. So there was a switch in Canaanite mythology from El to Baal becoming supreme. Like Baal, Yahweh is said to ride on the clouds. We have a poetic passage in which that's the case. His revelations are accompanied by thunder, storms, earthquakes. Baal is a god of the storm.
So what Christine Hayes is basically saying to Christians and Jews, that what you're believing here is nothing new. The texts of the Old Testament there's some new stuff, yes, but it's coming from stories and traditions and texts and narratives that predate it.
Let's get to some objections. So the first objection that you've seen, and you actually listed them out for me, the ones that you've seen, is, well, you're taking casual comments about Santa Claus and comparing God to Santa and fairies and everything. You're taking these casual comments too seriously. So how do you respond to this objection to this challenge?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, if that's what someone says, and I have seen that said, well, then the person is kind of indirectly admitting that this is not a true analogy to God. These are not truly analogous things. And in such a case, then we would just ask you to be consistent with your language, or clarify that you're being hyperbolic and God really isn't like Santa Claus or whatever else that you want to compare him to.
You just basically you've admitted that you're just being rhetorical. You're using a rhetorical. Yeah. You're not giving an argument. You're not making an actual salient point about theism. You're basically playing games and being pejorative.
Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? In the name of progress, modern man has tried to answer those questions without reference to God. But the answers that came back were not exhilarating, but dark and terrible. You are the accidental byproduct of nature. There is no reason for your existence. All you face is death. Modern man thought that in killing God, he had freed himself from everything that repressed and stifled him. Instead, he discovered that in killing God, he had unwittingly killed himself. For if God does not exist, man's life is ultimately absurd.
All right, so here's the second objection. Obviously, there are some differences between God and X, and put whatever you want in X, like Santa or fairies or whatever else. But the similarity is the lack of evidence. It's really about a lack of evidence. That's the whole point.
Mm-hmm. This is where your scale becomes very important, Cameron, and I think that it's really helpful because, okay, in your mind, there's a similarity between God and Santa Claus because you don't think you have good reason to believe either one exists. Okay, that's fine, but it's not just that. This is why we laid this out for you with the top scale, which was 0 to 100 positive, and then negative 100 below that to positive 100, because it's not just that you're both sitting, those propositions are both sitting at 0 with nothing to recommend them. Actually, we're on the bottom scale, and with Santa Claus, you have evidence that Santa Claus does not exist. Or in your case, tigers in the room, you have good reason to believe tigers don't exist. So this is where the two scales, I think, become very, very important, because what we're seeing here is that there are good reasons to disbelieve in Santa Claus, and that's a relevant difference.
You said, guys, look around you at the whole world, every culture over all human history. Atheism is not the default position. I love this comment you made because I remember talking to your boss, Greg, and I told him that I wasn't a Christian, and we talked about it, and I said that I don't live my life like Christianity is true, therefore, and I don't believe in any other God, so therefore I don't call myself a Christian, and I call myself an atheist. And Greg loved that definition. He told me, he said, I like that you said that you don't live your life like it's true, that Christianity is true. But I think Greg would say that anybody who doesn't live their life like Christianity is true is a functional atheist. If you're a Muslim and you don't live your life like Christianity is true, because you're a Muslim, you're a functional atheist. Because there's only one worldview that is correct. There's only one God. So functionally, Muslims are atheists. Orthodox Jews are atheists who don't accept Jesus Christ as Lord. Hindus are atheists. So really, the view that the Christian God is real and true is a vast, vast minority position. And even Christians would say other Christians are not true Christians. So how many true Christians are there out there if all the rest are functional atheists? Maybe atheism is indeed the default position in that sense.
All right, another objection. So what if I genuinely do lack belief in Santa as opposed to believe that Santa doesn't exist?
So we kind of got to this one earlier. You raised it, Cameron. And I think that what we've said there is if you genuinely lack a belief, about whether Santa Claus exists, if that's what you're telling me, either you are a very, very rare sort of person in the world today, or, and this is where I'm saying this could just be me, and maybe this is not charitable, I'm finding it hard to take that consideration genuinely. And it kind of reminds me of one of your recent responses to Stephen Woodford, Cameron, where you said something about like, well, what if aliens did it? And you just kind of backed away in the chair. That's kind of how I feel at this moment with someone who is telling me that they genuinely just merely lack a belief in Santa.
Do you believe, Derek, that people are being abducted by aliens with almond eyes and big gray heads? Do you think that's happening?
No.
Okay. Do you realize that the evidence for alien abduction is not only more accurate and reliable and less preposterous than the evidence for a soul or a god? Because with aliens, we're not claiming anything beyond the natural. With souls and gods, we're claiming something supernatural. So by definition, alien abductions are more plausible than a god, and yet you don't believe alien abductions, but you will believe near-death experiences.
So the last objection is, what do you mean by Santa? Because when we're talking about Santa, there was this sort of Saint Nicholas, and there were some true things about him. So it really depends on what we mean.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. It's a little more sophisticated, but here's the thing. If that's the case, if we're just talking about a historical figure, and you're saying you lack a belief in that particular historical figure, but you're not including sort of the Western understanding of Santa Claus with the magic and the going all over the world in one night and placing the presents and all that, if you're going just for that historical, then the whole reason you would use Santa Claus doesn't have any potency anymore.
Most historical figures that we have accounts of have legendary tales told about them and set patterns. That was true for George Washington. It's true for Julius Caesar. It's true for the founder of Hasidic Judaism, the Baal Shem Tov, who allegedly could heal the sick and cast out demons and raise the dead and be transfigured before his followers. Does that mean he didn't exist? No, everybody knows that Baal Shem Tov existed. There's no doubt about that. I could illustrate this by giving point after point. Let me just give you one more detailed illustration. Octavian, Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Literally, he was allegedly the Son of God. He was miraculously born. He was revered as the Son of God by his devotees. He ascended to heaven. He is a divine being worthy of worship. There are all these tales told about him. Does that mean he didn't exist? No, it means that when you tell stories about him, you tell these stories in certain ways. This is typically what happens with important figures from the past. The fact that stories are molded to a model has no bearing on whether the person actually existed or not.
Okay, even if Jesus existed, even if the early church had a high Christology, you can still be an atheist.
You lack the belief in a particular historical figure. Okay. And frankly, I don't think this is why most people use this phrase. And if so, then when they use it without clarifying that is a bit disingenuous. That's sneaky, because the person is making that comparison because they know that the impression that's being given to at least modern Western audiences is of a particular magical fat man that travels and gives presents all over the world every Christmas. So, but if you're just saying I lack a belief that there was a particular historical figure from whence the Santa Claus myth grew, okay, well, that's not saying anything really all that meaningful.
It's as to where the kalam goes wrong. Everything that begins to exist has an explanation for its existence. The universe, or as a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence. That is the full and total kalam cosmological argument. At no point in there does it say what the cause is at all. It is only people saying, we're going to call that cause God. God is not even a premise within the kalam cosmological argument. God is not a premise, as far as I can tell, in any of your arguments. It is, these are the universe requires a mind, this requires a mind, this reduces down to where it requires a mind, which is something that I don't necessarily accept we've gotten to. But even if it does, now all of a sudden, God is that mind.
Okay, so you're just upset with the title then?
Yes, because here's the thing. I live in a world where the overwhelming majority of people, currently and throughout history, have believed in a variety of different gods. And they use the label, and it carries with it some baggage. And whenever we want to have a discussion or debate about whether or not this is a reasonable thing to accept, they toss out all the baggage and then just make God this, the God of classical theism, or the nondescript, that God is the first cause. And I'm not saying anything else about his properties. I'm not saying whether or not he is, has any desires for people or cares who you sleep with or whatever else. It's just this. And so in a sense, it is, and in every circumstance, it is, here's a mystery. It needs to have some explanation. I'm going to call that God, and I'm going to tell you nothing else about God other than that is the label I'm putting on the explanation, which tells us nothing. There's no edification there. It is not anything that you could even build a religion off of. It's not consistent with what the overwhelming majority of people, if I go out and poll people of all religions, not just Christianity, what's God? Are they going to come up with God is the mind that is responsible for the fact that there's a mind?
An atheist website, you can see here, atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God, nor does it answer any other question about what a person believes. It is simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. Atheism is too often defined incorrectly as a belief system. To be clear, atheism is not a disbelief in gods or a denial of gods. It is a lack of belief in gods. What Braxton has noticed is that there's a conflict between that and what some atheists say sometimes. So from the same people, the same organization, the American Atheist, this is a billboard that they produced. Just skip church, it's all fake news. Now, to me, that sounds like that's not just like, oh, okay, we just lack belief in God. You're claiming that it's fake. You're asserting that thing does not exist. And so there's a tension here.
There could be a God, a deity that exists, or many gods that exist, but the God of the Old Testament or the God of the Bible is false. So it's not like this blanket thing where, oh, yeah, I read the Old Testament, therefore I'm an atheist. No, it doesn't work that way. It's just, I don't believe that God exists. And if that God, if that God does exist, why in the world would you worship him? Or I think I'm giving the sentiment of most atheists here. I understand their viewpoint. When you're a Christian, a born-again Christian, when you're an evangelical Christian, it's really hard for you to imagine that there could be a God existing and the Bible false. I understand it's so incredibly difficult. It's like, in fact, just me saying it right now, there's going to be sparks going off in between the neurons in your brain. It's like, does not compute. How can there be a God and the Bible false? It just does not make sense. Is he like this or not? And why would you worship this God? And is there anything this God could do where you would say, you know what? I reject it. You could just reject Judaism, Christianity, and become a deist. That's a great out for you. Yeah, exactly. You get your explanation for first cause. Well, yeah, I know your wife might cry. And I know Biola might cut you off. And your dad might be disappointed. I understand all that. I went through that. But you'll still get some benefits. Like you can still believe in an afterlife if you want. But you don't have to do YouTube videos like this, where you're kind of coming up with these options that are not really sufficient.